Greetings. I just wanted to mention a few things from your textbook, Crime, Justice, and Human Rights by Walker, Fishwick, and Marmo. I've really been pleased with this book. This is the first time I've really used this book in a class, and I'm very pleased because it offers us so much areas to cover and is very helpful in terms of setting up ideas for debate halls and papers and case studies. Chapter 7, Crime Prevention, addresses a lot of different issues at the international level. And of course, going to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime provides a wealth of information that you can obtain there. And I've posted one document in our class to review on prevention. It's a pretty long document, so you might just want to scan it to see if there's any relevant parts that you really want to pursue in more detail. One of the interesting features in terms of crime prevention that's mentioned is from prevention to preemption and getting into the security and surveillance and risk. And they provide all these, the authors provide all these key terms that, could be papers in themselves as it relates to human rights, such as target hardening, increased surveillance by, for example, cameras or drones or certain ID checks or biometrics or profiling, telecommunications, social media tracking, data mining, and implant technology, just to name some of the many that we could see. And then, of course, the costs and the benefits and how this could actually lead to a variety of human rights violations. Also, there's kind of a mini case study on the failure on the war on drugs that we've seen and how the problem actually became worse. We see increased drug use, the increased criminal marketplace, displacement, also diversion of funds from healthcare, the stigma attached to drug users, and a lot of other problems as well. Right now we're in the opioid crisis. If you look back at my videos, around 4 or 5 years ago I was teaching a policy analysis course, and I predicted that we were going to have a big problem because of the policies, the rules, procedures, and the ways we went after the opioid situation 4 or 5 years ago. And unfortunately, I was correct. I wish I was terribly wrong. And my opinion now is we're still failing by implementing policy that may sound good on paper or when some politician talks about it, but in practice and looking at the research doesn't work. And I've recommended to take a closer look at other models that have worked in Australia and in Portugal, for example, and use those models as they would apply. So you have to obviously adapt those models to the current situation in other locations. But I think there's a lot of potential for change. Unfortunately, it seems we're doing more of the same, or my prediction is that things are actually going to get worse. And the question is, how worse do they get before we can start seeing them get better or start coming up with some new ideas? So, of course, what politician is going to listen to some middle-aged cranky criminologist? Okay, Chapter 8, Policing. And what's interesting is the authors start by saying police are the protectors, but also abusers of human rights. And then they get into a discussion on use of force, which really, you could have a whole course on use of force. And I'm not going to get into those debates, but there's certainly a lot more research I've seen in the recent years about use of force, about different strategies that are used, about setting up a continuum of use of force, looking at when certain procedures are appropriate and not. It's an extremely difficult situation since simulations differ than real life scenarios, and often there's really split seconds to make a decision. And I wish I had a answer on how we could do that with minimization of problems, but it's a very difficult situation given the limitations of human cognition and brain functioning. Also, they look at human rights and police strategies and contexts in terms of styles of policing, and how that may be related to human right violations such as zero tolerance policing, intelligence-led policing, security policing, community policing, privatized policing, problem-oriented policing, quality of life policing, and procedural justice. So there's a lot of different aspects there, and different communities have set up different areas or different strategies or types of or styles of policing. And what we may see is that you have to really look at the context of the situation to see what will work given that situation. But there's a lot of interest here in looking at, and more recently, public order policing and protests. That's been a very tough situation for police departments, because if you ask me, police departments have been put in a double bind. They're if they do something, they're critiqued severely. If they don't do something, they're critiqued severely. That's a stressful, chaotic, ambiguous situation to be in that I think puts undue stress on police departments. And so hopefully there's more research to come up with ideas and to see what happens. I think Seattle Police Department, probably, and New York Police Department, to name a few, are kind of the experts in dealing with protests, and so we do have some models to see what actually works and different variations on interventions. But that's a very interesting area to pursue as well. I've always had an interest in riots, but not really in policing and protest or riots, but my interest has been the process of how riots take place and form. Believe it or not, when I started studying riots, we didn't have the internet. Actually, I don't think I even had a computer. That's how long ago it was. And now, of course, social media comes into play, and I've had to wrap my mind around all that, and that's changed a lot. That certainly my education never ends. It continues. And I continue to try to understand very complex aspects related to human rights, protests, riots, and social media. And of course, I just read our university has a degree in analyzing large data sets or data analytics, and you get into all that stuff that probably we only dreamed about 15 years ago. But some fascinating features there, certainly. Chapter 9 focuses on criminal courts that goes over some of the internal and external constraints in terms of classifying some problems that could be related. Oops, sorry. Okay, we're going to have to take this cat and put her on the floor here. Okay, back to criminal courts. That sometimes happens. When your wife adopts kittens, they basically just do whatever they want. Okay, the internal constraints and the external constraints. And so I think, again, backlogs, funding, personnel, the pressure put on prosecutors to convict for certain crimes, racial biases, then external constraints such as the criminal sentencing, mandatory sentences, and then looking at, from England, antisocial behavior orders, and of course that's interesting. And then they look at therapeutic jurisprudence and restorative justice and problem-solving courts. So of course all this is interrelated. Whether you're talking about courts, policing, Chapter 10 on detention, or crime prevention. But let me just mention a few things about Chapter 10 on detention. And of course, the big issue that the United States faces is our extremely high prison or our extremely high incarceration rate, higher than most other countries. that are high tech and industrialized, and that's a big problem. Also, they talk about the racialized moral panics that we've seen, and they talk about civil and political rights and use torture as a case study. And then also about some of the other aspects as well. For example, in the United States, they address the right to vote debate regarding prisoners, and also, whether or not those convicted of a felony should be able to vote. And they point out 2 states have banned voting by anyone convicted of a felony. And then they wrap up by talking about privatization of prisons and the profit motive there, and also how that relates to lobbying, funding, and of course it goes back to the court system, policing, and programs and accountability, and how different prisoners are treated, and rehabilitation. And then of course we could bring in recidivism studies and the like. Whatever the case is, we have a lot of work to continue to do in the future, and a lot of research, and a lot of unanswered questions as well. I'm still trying to figure out what works in specific situations to resolve problems. And sometimes I think I may have a few good ideas, but I haven't figured out how to get those out past the classroom and my YouTube videos. So if you're a politician and you just happen to stumble over this YouTube video, first, I would say welcome, and secondly, look at the research out there and start thinking about policies that are related to the research. Now, the hard part for a politician is convincing the public that this is a good thing, and so I understand that from being on the other side of a treatment provider, when the public is not real excited about providing treatment. A lot of times when I talk to people and they find out I'm in criminal justice, they say, well, what do you think about prisoners getting, psychotherapy and education and spending all that money on training? I said, well, it's a wonderful idea. And they say, no, that's not. And so you get into all those debates as well. What's on the back of my mind is reducing recidivism, reducing problems, reducing costs. And I think in the long run, a lot of us have the same goals. We just have different means to get to that place. And that gets us into the areas of debate. So I just wanted to mention a few things about those chapters. Some you may have already read, some you'll be reading in the future. But again, I really was happy with just the wealth of areas that we can pursue in here. Some that I've studied, some I've rarely read on at all. So definitely some interesting material. Thank you.